Hello everyone, and thank you for coming. There's a good chance most of you know who I am, but as this is an open venue and some of you may have just stepped in for refreshments, it makes sense to start with an introduction. Hey, it's working, great. My name is Jon Lock, and I'm the writer and creator of a comic called Afterlife Inc. I'm also the co-founder of Big Punch Studios, a Cheltenham-based publisher of comics, games, and podcasts. Alongside Afterlife Inc., we're the creative team behind Seven String, Extraversal, Catamaran, and numerous other adventures in worlds both wondrous and strange. We're also the creators of Sandwich Masters, a fast-paced card game about strategy, sabotage, and you guessed it, sandwiches. I hate the phrase entrepreneurial, so if this sounds in any way impressive, please note that all I ever wanted to do was tell stories. Running a business was just a happy accident that happened along the way. Now, ever since I got the call from a festival, desperately seeking a secondary headliner to rival David Cameron, I've been thinking about how best to use my time in the limelight and how to give something back to both my hometown and an institution that I've admired for so long. One of the biggest questions we receive as creators is, how do I break into comics? And while I've yet to find the definitive answer, one thing I can say is how to break into comics for Jon Lock way. So please consider this my TED Talk on finding success and the admiration of millions through comics. Pencils at the ready, there will be questions at the end. Step one is to start young. If you grew up in the UK, there's a good chance that you were born with an innate affinity for the Beano and Dandy, those classic British humour comics. American comics, in which people wear spandex and punch each other, used to be a little harder to come by on this side of the Atlantic. So if you're like me, your superhero intake was mostly limited to Saturday morning cartoons. The trick, however, is to consume any and all comics you can get your hands on, from Thomas the Tank Engine to Tintin. Grant Morrison, my favourite writer, has a theory that comics are some primal form of storytelling akin to cave paintings that children will instinctively gravitate towards. It's only later, when we teach the importance of proper books, that comics are forcibly cast aside. Now, the next step on the road to comic greatness is to find your touchstone book, the thing that shifts your perspective from enjoying comics purely as a reader to thinking about the creative process that went into making them. If you could employ a time machine to travel back to the mid-90s, I'd suggest picking up Sonic the Comic. Sonic the Comic, or STC, was possibly the weirdest comic ever released in the UK. Starting out as an officially licensed Sonic the Hedgehog title, it quickly evolved into a mind-bending saga of epic proportions, thanks to the sheer creativity of the minds behind it, and presumably some lax editorial control. Sonic the Comic taught me not just that comics can, and should always be, weird, but that there were people behind the pages I loved. Comics had writers, pencilers, inkers, colorists, letterers, editors, a whole team of creators coming together to create one seamless work of art. For me and my friends, the knowledge that anyone could make a comic was electrifying, and so, thus empowered, we found ourselves at step 3, blatant copyright infringement. When starting your journey into comics, it's important to steal from the best, as it's often only in recreating something we love that we uncover the true creative process behind it. For me, this began with a comic called Big Punch, our primary school level attempt to recreate the magic of Sonic the Comic. In among the plot holes and raw, unbridled creativity, however, I did learn an important lesson, namely that there was a way to make comics even if you weren't the most artistically gifted person. Even in those early days, I found myself adopting the role of writer, while my friends illustrated my scripts. Moving forward, the next step, and this is a really important one, is to grow out of it. Or not, in my case. The transition from primary to secondary school is not the best time to be making a comic about anthropomorphic porcupines. And I eventually learned to internalize my world building, while my more sensible friends put their childhood pursuits behind them. Your teenage years are also the point at which you're most likely to expand your literary horizons, finding darker, edgier comics to match those strange new feelings. This will probably be reflected in your changing creative output. My first attempt at a serious story was everything you'd expect from a daft kid trying to find their place in the world. Dark Force, as the name suggests, was, well, it was a little intense. This was the tail end of the 90s, a very special period in comics in which everything that wasn't gnarly was radical, and where the only things better than muscles were spikes, chains, and claws. My teenage superheroes battled monsters and demons, and looked good doing it. But they also wrestled with the big issues that kept me awake at night. I suppose, looking back, that it was therapy of sorts, a way to break down a strange, uncaring universe into something simple and easy to punch. Dark Force would be something I'd return to again and again over the coming years, even throughout university while pursuing a biology degree. The problem was that my stories at that point in my life were about everything and nothing at the same time. I remember hearing a quote once about the difference between humour and comedy, the idea being that humour is internal and only makes sense to a small group of people, whereas comedy is universal. The process of turning an in-joke into an actual joke with setup and punchline is hard and requires tough editorial choices. For me, this was a level of scrutiny I wasn't ready to take, and as such, my concepts continued to lumber on in my head without going anywhere. While I drew a little bit just to get my ideas on paper, I also lacked the skills to truly bring my stories to life. In short, I was stuck with a lot of ambition, an incomplete skill set, and no idea how to move forward. The next step, conveniently, is despair. With all those hopes and dreams, it's important to hit a roadblock early on that forces you to reassess the path you're on. My quarter-life crisis involved graduating and running away to Canada, where I spent a year selling coffee and books while meeting and learning from as many creators as possible. My biggest Canadian revelation came quite early on in my trip, and no, it wasn't the shock discovery that poutine is just cheesy chips with gravy. Having met some relatively big names at a comic festival in Toronto, and having subjected them to the same sprawling pitch for what Dark Force could, should, and would be were I to ever make it, I was stopped short and provided with the best and harshest piece of advice I've ever received. There is nothing more overrated than a good idea. It was a flashbulb moment for me, and frankly, a little devastating, because it was true. I spent years planning and imagining greatness without ever actually doing anything about it. I realized then that as much as I loved them, my stories had become a millstone around my neck. I needed a clean break. I needed something new. The next step is to create Afterlife Inc. You can probably insert the title of your own magnum opus here, but the key point is to focus on your second story. Not the one that means the most to you, but the one that could mean the most to other people. Now, your Afterlife Inc. can be about anything you want. But for me, it was the tale of a con artist named Jack Fortune, who died, discovered an afterlife in chaos, and decided to take over and run it like a business. To this day, I'm not entirely sure where the idea came from. My first thought had been to create a murder mystery set in the afterlife, but my hard-boiled detective quickly morphed into a silver-tongued huckster with a heart of gold. Those early days of Afterlife Inc. were liberating, and made me realize just how bogged down I'd become in my previous projects. Afterlife Inc. was free to go anywhere. Nevertheless, there were certain aspects of the story that I knew had to happen. More fact than fiction. For example, the story had to take place on a flat, multi-tiered world. Our hero would be called Jack Kismet, or Fate, or something. And he had to have a massive tie that floated through the air. His friend would be made of gold metal and handle all the paperwork. As you can probably tell from those early days, I didn't have a lot of creative tools at my disposal. These early sketches were done with a red crayon on the back of an envelope. I also remember scribbling character designs on napkins while on break in the Starbucks where I worked. That Starbucks was oddly influential as it happens, with a colleague's dog, Lux, providing a name for a character, and a pack of sugar inspiring Annahel, our oddly unconventional archangel. That year in Canada was a massive source of inspiration. I'd travelled, met fellow creators, grown as a person, and even though, at the end of it all, I'd yet to actually make a comic, I returned to the UK energised, full of new ideas, and ready to strike while the iron was hot. The next step is to wait 3 years before doing anything. Although I suppose that's not entirely true. While working on bringing your dreams to life, you should probably also check off some key achievements, such as finding a place to live, finding someone you care about, and finding your first proper job. The latter, in fact, will prove incredibly useful in commissioning some of your first professional artwork. Making comics is an expensive, time-consuming process, and while I was willing to sacrifice my sleeping sanity to make these stories, it didn't seem fair to expect an artist to do the same with the promise of reward further down the road. Having a day job meant that I could pay an artist for their time and effort, even if only in short bursts. Around this time, I started fixing the designs of my characters on paper. I'd recently had my first short stories published by Comfort Love and Adam Withers, an amazing husband and wife creative partnership who I'd met on my travels abroad. Through them, I made connections with a number of indie creators who I would go on to work with. The first time I saw my sketches translated into actual artwork, here captured by the amazing Jamie Boylan, was humbling to say the least. Right from the start, I had a structure in place for how Afterlife Inc. would begin, proceed, and end. I realized, however, that at that point in my life, I lacked the resources and skills to do it justice. Instead, I decided to do something a little different. With the help of an incredible Boston artist named Ash Jackson, who would go on to define the look and feel of the series, I put together a short story set in the world of Afterlife Inc. It was intended to be a standalone introduction to the series, one I could pitch to publishers, and somehow the idea got away from me. One story spiraled into 2, then 3, then 4. And after a year, I had enough content for my first book, a book that in no way featured in my original plan for the series. I'd never set out to be a self-publisher. Growing up, I thought the only way to make comics was to work for Marvel or DC, and yet here I was booking a table for my first ever comic convention. The year was 2012, and Stan Lee was making his first UK appearance in decades at the inaugural London Super Comic Con at the Excel Centre in London. For those who haven't been, the venue is essentially an aircraft hangar, nearly a kilometre long on one side. So imagine Stan Lee, several tens of thousands of fans, and maybe 20 dealer tables, of which I was one. I had no idea what to expect. I would have been happy to have sold just a couple of books. I ended up selling 2/3 of my stock. It was shocking, to say the least, and thanks to a hungry crowd with time on their hands and poor impulse control, I had finally arrived on the UK comics scene. Assuming you've stepped out into the world and started making and selling your work, you should probably keep that ball rolling. Over the next few years, we toured conventions pretty relentlessly. And by we, I mean me and Lucy, my then girlfriend and now wife, who was kind and patient enough to accompany me on this odd endeavour. I don't think long suffering really does it justice. At the same time, the productivity continued, with one unplanned title turning into 2 and then 3. Before I knew it, I had a loose trilogy of well-received books to my name. I'd even run a successful Kickstarter, somehow ending up as one of the first UK comics to be funded on the platform, thanks to the incredible support of my fans, family, and friends. Speaking of friends, and this is an important one, you should probably reach out to the people around you. In exhibiting at conventions and meeting fellow creators, I ended up making some of the most significant friendships of my life. Chief among them was Nick and Ali. Nick was a fellow creator whose book, 7 String, was about a world where music was magic. I thought it was amazing, and Nick, in turn, seemed to like Afterlife Inc., or tolerate at least. So, seeing that these worlds were so obviously compatible, we did the only sensible thing and made a crossover. The Heavenly Chord was significant in that A, it was awesome, and B, we left it in canon, inadvertently creating a shared universe. We were left with no logical alternative but to join forces. Over the coming years, the 4 of us united, first as convention buddies and then as a partnership, before finally incorporating as Big Punch Studios, an actual, honest-to-goodness company in 2015. Since then, our fortunes, like our storylines, have been intertwined. The 4 of us even moved in together and began work on new and exciting projects, branching out into games with the aforementioned Sandwich Masters. This was new territory for us, and as with so many of our projects, we were really just making it up as we went along and hoping for the best. Despite some inevitable missteps, we also got a few things right, such as a bizarre moment in which Sandwich Masters became Kickstarter's global project of the day. As making our larger books was a slow process, in 2015 we launched a new title to increase our productivity and showcase some new ideas. Big Punch magazine, later renamed Extraversal, was a true collaboration between the four of us, showcasing all our skills. As a quarterly magazine serializing several ongoing stories, however, it was also an ambitious undertaking. But we were younger, a little less tired, and up for the challenge. Cuckoos, our flagship title, dove deep into the mythology of the Big Punch multiverse. It was also a great representation of what we were capable of as a team, with me writing, Nick drawing, Ali colouring, and Lucy lettering. Orb, illustrated by Jack Tempest and V. Glass, was my opportunity to go full sci-fi and present an alternate history of the 20th century in which alien gods and giant floating stone warships dictated the fate of humanity. 99 Swords, illustrated by James State and Sarah Millman, was just plain fun. It was also the first time that Lucy and I wrote something together. Following Elsie Blackwood and Tyler Goldensheath in their quest to unite 99 magical blades, 99 Swords remains one of the most entertaining and straightforward adventures I've ever worked on, and it's something we hope to return to in the future. After a punishing schedule over 4 years, Extraversal culminated in December 2018 with a year-long crossover called Perfect Storm, featuring 40 named characters from 7 series. Our endgame moment, if you will. Extraversal lives on in the collected graphic novels and as a podcast. And while we were sad to see the end of the magazine, we were also very much in need of a break. You see, an important step that I may have glossed over here is that you're probably going to get sick at some point during this period of intense productivity. I'm no doctor, but given that we were all doing this on top of our day jobs, and that we also arranged 2 marriages and bought our first houses during this time, exhaustion was probably a big factor. 1 appendectomy later, and you'll be feeling a lot better, even if the work-life balance remains tricky at times. So where do we stand now? As with any endeavour in which you're dancing as fast as you can, it's important to pause and reflect every now and then. To date, I've published 5 volumes of Afterlife Inc., 6 if you include The Heavenly Chord, and 7 if you include the hardback collected edition of books 1 to 3. I've co-published 16 issues of Extraversal and 1 collected edition with more to follow. I've co-created a kids comic called Zoolog with an amazing artist named Ben Haith, which teaches kids about ecology and evolution through the medium of monsters. So finally using that biology degree. And as of this month, work has just begun on Afterlife Inc. Volume 6, thanks to the incredible work of artist V. Glass. Our heroes are battered, bruised, and more than a little world-weary, but eager to face the horizon, whatever it may bring. So is this the final step on the road to success in comics? Well, it's definitely a step, although success suggests that you've reached a conclusion. And as long as there are stories to tell, I'm not sure the work will ever really end. Perhaps a better measure of success is to consider your method of travel rather than the inevitable destination. I'm lucky enough to have spent the last 8 years making comics and building worlds with the people I care about. That these stories have meant something to people, not least myself, is just the icing on the cake. Comics are ultimately a collaborative medium, and just as every page goes from concept to script, to pencils, to inks, to colours, to letters, and to print, I wouldn't be here today if not for the love and support of everyone who's helped me along the way. So if you'd like to break into comics the Jon Lock way, go find some collaborators, some cohorts, some partners, and some friends, and build something wonderful together. Thank you for listening.